The sledgehammer felt like an extension of her grief, a weighted club of iron and sorrow. Amelia's arms burned with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle, a weariness of the soul. Dust, thick and ancient, swirled in the beam of the single lantern, coating her tongue and stinging her eyes. Each swing was a grunt of frustration. A blow against the creditors who circled like vultures. A blow against the pitying glances in town. A blow against the memory of her husband, Rowan, who had sunk their last dollar into this ruin and left her with nothing but questions and a crumbling legacy. The wall of the cellar was damp stone and decaying plaster, an ugly, stubborn barrier. Lily sat on the top step of the cellar stairs, a small, silent sentinel with her knees drawn to her chest, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. "Is it almost done, Mamma?" Her voice was a tiny thread in the vast, oppressive silence of the mansion. "Almost, sweetling," Amelia gasped, readjusting her grip on the rough wooden handle. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for. A hollow sound, that's what had started it. A strange resonant Rowan had marked on a blueprint with a cryptic note, "The heart is not where they think it is." He had been obsessed with this house, with its secrets. People had called it Blackwood Folly, a monument to a madman's dream. Now it was her folly. With a final, desperate surge of energy, she swung the hammer. The impact was different this time. Not a dull thud, but a sharp crack that splintered into a deep, guttural crunch. The stone gave way. A ragged, dark hole gaped in the wall, exhaling a breath of cold, impossibly ancient air. It smelled of wet earth and stillness, of a place that had not known light for a century. The lantern light trembled in her hand, pushing back against a blackness that seemed to drink it in. It wasn't a crawl space. It wasn't a hidden pantry. It was an opening, a moor leading into profound and utter darkness. The memory of the lawyer's office was still sharp, a sterile room that smelled of stale paper and condescension. Mr. Hemlock had peered at her over his spectacles, his expression one of carefully practiced sympathy. "Your husband, Mrs. Thorne, left considerable debts." He shuffled papers, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The mercantile, the bank, they are not patient institutions." Amelia had held Lily's hand, the small fingers a warm anchor in the cold sea of her new reality. Rowan's death in the rockslide had been ruled an accident, a tragic end for a man they said was chasing fantasies. He was a surveyor by trade, but a dreamer by nature, and his final dream had been this house. Blackwood Manor. He'd shown her the deed with a manic gleam in his eye, talking of its history, its solid bones, its potential. She had seen only a black hole into which their savings disappeared. "There is one asset," Hemlock had continued, pulling a thick, yellow document from a drawer. "He purchased the old Blackwood place outright. It is yours. And your daughter's." A wave of dizziness had washed over her. The folly. The one thing she couldn't sell, because no one in their right mind would buy it. It was isolated, rumored to be unstable, and miles from any semblance of civilization. It was a tomb, not a home. They had moved in out of sheer necessity, the whispers of the townsfolk following them like a bitter wind. "Poor Amelia," they'd say. Tied to that foolish man's last mistake, the mansion was a shell of its former self. Rainwater stained the ceilings, and the floors creaked with the sorrow of 100 years of neglect. Every peeling strip of wallpaper, every shattered pane in the high windows, was a testament to her failure, to Rowan's failure. They were trapped, she and Lily, in the skeletal remains of another family's forgotten grandeur, with winter approaching and their food stores dwindling. Desperation had become a physical presence, a cold guest at their sparse dinner table. It was this desperation that had led her to the cellar, to the strange, coded blueprints Rowan had left behind, and to the hollow-sounding wall he had marked with an X. He wasn't a fool, he had insisted in his last days. He was on the verge of something. "Everything I'm doing, Amelia," he had said, his eyes intense, "it's to make us safe." Forever she hadn't believed him then. But as she stood before the darkness he had hidden, a flicker of his wild hope ignited within her own exhausted heart. Returning to the present moment, Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet. She held the lantern higher, its golden light pushing tentatively into the void. The opening led into a natural cavern, the rough-hewn stone of the cellar wall giving way to the smooth, water-worn rock of the earth itself. The air was cool and carried the scent of deep, untroubled ground. "Mama, what is it?" Lily whispered, her fear now edged with a child's irrepressible curiosity. "I don't know," Amelia answered, her voice raspy. "Stay there, Lily." Right on that step she squeezed through the opening, her worn dress snagging on a jagged edge of broken plaster. The floor of the cave was uneven but solid under her boots. The lantern cast dancing shadows that made the cavern walls seem to breathe. It was larger than she could have imagined, a vast subterranean chamber that stretched back into darkness far beyond the reach of her light. A path, too deliberate to be natural, snaked its way deeper into the gloom. It was as if someone had cleared the larger stones, creating a walkway. Rowan. It had to be him. With trembling hands, she followed the path, her footsteps echoing softly in the immense space. The beam of her lantern swept across the chamber, revealing glittering veins of quartz in the rock and the slow, steady drip of water from a stalactite high above. Then the light caught something else. Tucked into a natural alcove, almost hidden from view, was a small, dark shape. A chest. It was old, bound with rusted iron straps, its wood softened and warped by the relentless damp. It wasn't large, but it was heavy, solid. Kneeling beside it, she worked her fingers under the lid, the corroded latch groaning in protest before snapping with a sharp crack. She lifted the heavy top. For a moment, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, that the flickering lantern light was creating an illusion. But the sight remained, solid and real. Gold. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins, tarnished with age but unmistakably real, bearing the markings of foreign mints and forgotten eras. Nestled among them, wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of uncut stones that caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Diamonds. A fortune beyond her wildest comprehension, lying dormant beneath the foundations of her ruin. For 3 days, Amelia lived in a state of suspended disbelief. She moved the chest from the cave in the dead of night, dragging it across the stone floor and hiding it beneath a loose flagstone in the pantry, a place only she knew about. Every few hours, she would lift the stone just to look, to touch the cold, heavy coins and the sharp-edged diamonds, reassuring herself that it wasn't a dream born of desperation. The treasure was a shield, a promise of escape. But it was also a question. Where had it come from? And why had Rowan hidden it here, instead of simply using it to save them from their financial ruin? The answer lay at the bottom of the chest. Beneath the last layer of coins, wrapped in a separate oilskin pouch, was a leather-bound journal. His journal! Her hand shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with Rowan's familiar, cramped handwriting, a mix of surveying calculations, geological notes, and increasingly frantic personal entries. He had found the cave by accident while surveying the bedrock for the mansion's foundation. But the treasure, he explained, was not his discovery. It was a legend, a lost Spanish cache he'd stumbled upon. The real discovery, the one that had consumed him, was what the cave revealed about the land itself. He wrote of water tables, of subterranean streams, and of a powerful man named Alistair Finch, whose sprawling ranch bordered the Blackwood property. Finch was the titan of the territory, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. He owned the bank, had the politicians in his pocket, and was systematically buying up every parcel of land from here to the mountains. The journal detailed how Finch's property, once arid, had become miraculously lush, while the surrounding homesteads had withered, their wells running dry. Rowan's notes became a dark litany of accusation. "His diverting the water," he wrote. "The main aquifer runs directly beneath this house, through this cave system. Finch has found a way to tap it, to steal the very lifeblood of this valley for himself. The deeds are a lie. The boundaries have been moved." The final entries were filled with a chilling paranoia. "He knows I'm close. I see his men watching the house from the ridge. This treasure is our only way out. It is the means to an end, Amelia. A way to fight him. Do not trust anyone." The weight of the gold suddenly felt different. It was not a salvation, it was a weapon. And the man it was meant to be used against was the most dangerous man she had ever known. The name Alastair Finch hung in the air like a storm cloud. To fight him was unthinkable. He was an institution, a force of nature. Yet, Rowan's words echoed in her mind, a ghostly imperative. She needed more than the journal's frantic accusations, she needed confirmation. There was only one person she could possibly turn to. Samuel lived in a small, tidy cabin on the edge of the Blackwood property, a relic from a time before Finch owned everything in sight. He had been the groundskeeper for the Blackwood family decades ago and had refused to leave when they were forced to sell. He was old, with eyes that had seen the valley change, and he had always been kind to her and Lily, leaving them small parcels of vegetables on their porch without a word. She found him splitting firewood, the rhythmic thwack of his axe the only sound in the crisp morning air. She carried a carefully folded copy of one of Rowan's hand-drawn maps, one showing the intricate network of underground streams. She didn't mention the gold, only her late husband's research. "Samuel," she began, her voice unsteady. "I need to ask you about the water on this land." He stopped, leaning the axe against the woodpile, and wiped his brow with the back of a weathered hand. He looked at the map she held out, and a shadow passed over his features. "Your husband was a clever man," he said, his voice low. "Clever and brave. Too brave, maybe." He told her the story she had only heard in whispers. He spoke of the Blackwood family, proud and prosperous, and how their thriving ranch had turned to dust in a single season. Their creek dried to a trickle, their well became a pit of mud. Finch had offered to buy them out for pennies on the dollar. "They said it was a drought," Samuel said, his gaze fixed on the distant hills that marked Finch's territory. "But it only ever seemed to be a drought on this side of the valley." He then told her something that made her blood run cold. Rowan had visited him a week before his death. He'd been agitated, speaking of proof and justice. He had left something with Samuel for safekeeping. The old man disappeared into his cabin and returned with a small, intricately shaped iron key. "He told me this was for a lock that wasn't on a door," Samuel said, pressing it into her palm. "He said you would know what it meant when the time was right." As Amelia walked back to the mansion, the key feeling heavy and significant in her pocket, she saw them. Two men on horseback, sitting motionless on the ridge overlooking her home. They were dressed in dark coats, their faces indistinct at this distance, but their stillness was menacing. They were watching. Just as Rowan had written. The presence of the riders on the ridge transformed the mansion from a sanctuary into a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window frames, sounded like an approaching threat. That afternoon, the men descended from the ridge. They didn't ride to the front door but to the side of the house, their demeanor casual but their eyes sharp, missing nothing. Amelia met them on the porch, positioning herself so Lily was behind her. The taller of the two, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth, dismounted. He said, tipping his hat in a gesture devoid of any genuine respect. "Name's Carter. Mr. Finch sent us. Just a routine assessment of the property. There are some questions about unpaid taxes from the previous owner." It was a lie, and she knew it. The taxes were paid, it was the one thing Rowan had insured before he died. "I believe you'll find the accounts are all in order," she said, her voice colder and steadier than she felt. The second man remained on his horse, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip. Carter ignored her comment, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated state of the manor before settling on the cellar door at the side of the house. "Heard this place has a mighty big cellar," he said, his tone conversational. "Prone to flooding, they say. We'll need to check the foundations." The suggestion was so specific, so targeted, it sent a jolt of pure fear through her. They knew. Or they suspected. They were probing, searching for the source of Rowan's discovery. "That won't be necessary," Amelia said firmly. "The foundation is sound." Carter smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "Mr. Finch is a stickler for details. We'll be back tomorrow with the official paperwork. We'd hate for there to be any complications." The threat was unmistakable. He mounted his horse, and the two men rode away, leaving a thick silence in their wake. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She held the strange iron key in her hand, its unusual shape a puzzle she couldn't solve. A lock that wasn't on a door. She thought of Rowan's blueprints, his geological surveys, his obsession with the very rock beneath their feet. With a sudden surge of intuition, she lit the lantern, told Lily to stay locked in her room, and descended once more into the chilling darkness of the cave. She was no longer looking for treasure. She was looking for an answer. The cave felt different this time, charged with a new and terrifying urgency. The knowledge that Finch's men were coming back, that they were specifically interested in the cellar, lent a frantic energy to her search. She held the lantern high, its light carving a path through the oppressive blackness. The key felt cool and solid in her hand, a piece of a puzzle she had to solve before morning. A lock that wasn't on a door. The phrase circled in her mind. It wasn't a metaphor. Rowan was a literal man, a man of measurements and mechanics. The lock had to be physical. She ran her free hand along the damp cavern walls, feeling the texture of the rock, searching for anything out of place. She followed the cleared path deeper, past the alcove where the chest had been hidden, into a part of the cave she hadn't dared explore before. The air grew colder. Here, the cavern narrowed into a passage just wide enough for one person. The walls were slick with moisture. Her lantern beam fell upon a section of rock that seemed subtly different from the rest. It was a large, flat slab, almost perfectly vertical, with finer-grained stone that didn't quite match its surroundings. Her heart began to beat faster. She examined the surface, her fingers tracing faint, almost invisible seams. Near the bottom, hidden in a natural crevice and caked with dried mud, was a small, dark hole. It was no bigger than her thumb, a detail easily missed by anyone not looking for it. With trembling fingers, she wiped away the grime. It was a keyhole, artfully concealed. She inserted the iron key Samuel had given her. It slid in perfectly. She turned it. There was a low grinding sound, the protest of a mechanism unused for years, and then a deep, satisfying click. A section of the rock wall swung silently inward, revealing a smaller, man-made chamber carved directly into the stone. The air inside was dry and stale. On a simple stone shelf sat a heavy metal document box. This was it. This was Rowan's true legacy. She carried the box back to the kitchen, her mind reeling. Inside, it was all there. The original survey maps from the territory's founding, showing the true path of the aquifer. The sworn, notarized statements from a dozen families who had been run off their land by Finch, each telling the same story of wells going dry and mysterious intimidation. And the crown jewel, a set of forged deeds, complete with Finch's signature, alongside the legitimate deeds he had illegally voided. Rowan had built a fortress for the truth, and the treasure was merely the funding for the war he never got to fight. The first light of dawn was filtering through the grimy panes of the kitchen when she heard the sound of horses. They were back. But this time, it wasn't just the two henchmen. A third rider accompanied them, a man who sat his horse with an air of absolute authority. Alistair Finch. Amelia's blood ran cold. She quickly hid the metal box beneath the same loose flagstone that had concealed the treasure, her hands working with frantic speed. She took a deep breath, schooling her features into a mask of weary defiance, and went to face him. Finch was not what she expected. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, with a disarming smile and kind eyes that held no kindness at all. He dismounted with practiced ease, handing the reins to Carter. "Mrs. Thorne," he began, his voice smooth as polished river stone. "My apologies for this intrusion. My men can be overzealous. I wanted to handle this matter personally." He gestured toward the decaying mansion. "This is a magnificent old place. It requires a certain kind of owner, a person of means, to truly care for it. I imagine the burden must be overwhelming for a woman in your circumstances." The veiled insult was clear. He saw her as a weak, helpless widow. "We are managing," she replied, her tone clipped. Finch's smile didn't waver. "Of course. But I am a practical man. I am prepared to make you an offer. A generous one. Enough to buy a lovely home in town, to provide for your daughter for the rest of her life. All I ask is that you leave this place and forget any fanciful stories your late husband might have told you." There it was. The offer. The bribe. He knew. He didn't know what she had, but he knew she had something. The knowledge was a cold stone in her stomach. She thought of Rowan's death, of the displaced families, of the stolen water. She thought of Lily's future, a future built on silence and complicity. The house is not for sale, Mr. Finch. For the first time, a flicker of something hard and dangerous appeared in his eyes. The mask slipped. I strongly suggest you reconsider, Mrs. Thorne. Some things, once found, are better left buried. People who dig too deep often find themselves in unfortunate accidents. The threat, now naked and brutal, hung between them. He had just confessed to murdering her husband. He gestured subtly with his hand, and his two men, Carter and the other, began to move, flanking her, cutting off any escape. The confrontation had arrived. Panic seized her, a cold, constricting band around her chest. But then she saw Lily's face, peering from behind a curtain in the upstairs window, and the fear was forged into a sharp, cold resolve. She had to get them away from the house, away from the pantry where the proof lay hidden. You're trespassing, she said, her voice shaking but firm, taking a deliberate step backward toward the cellar entrance. You need to leave now. Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. The time for politeness is over. Find what her husband hid. Carter and the other man advanced. Amelia didn't run. She did exactly what Rowan's journal had instructed in a section titled Contingencies. She turned and fled, not toward the open fields, but down the rickety steps into the cavernous, dark cellar. It was a calculated risk, a desperate gambit based on the scribbled warnings of a dead man. The two henchmen followed, their heavy boots thudding on the wooden stairs. Finch remained at the top, silhouetted against the morning light, a patient predator waiting for the hunt to conclude. There's nowhere to run, Mrs. Thorne, Carter called out, his voice echoing in the damp space. Amelia scrambled over piles of debris, her lantern casting wild, leaping shadows. She knew this space intimately now. She knew which floorboards groaned, which support beams were rotten. Rowan had mapped every weakness. She reached the far wall, the one with the hole leading to the cave, and squeezed through it. The men were right behind her, cursing as they navigated the rubble. They followed her into the cave, their own lantern beams cutting sharp, white paths through the blackness. They were focused on her, on the chase. They didn't notice the network of thin tripwires Rowan had strung at ankle height, or the precariously balanced stack of heavy support timbers he had rigged above the cellar's main passageway. As the second man entered the cave, Amelia reached into a small crevice and pulled a cord. Above, in the cellar, a pin was released. There was a groaning splinter of wood, then a deep, thunderous crash as tons of rotten timber and stone collapsed, sealing the cellar entrance completely. Dust billowed out of the hole in the wall, followed by the muffled shouts of the trapped men. She was alone with the blackness, and the sound of Alastair Finch's footsteps descending the cellar stairs, now heading toward the only way out. Amelia scrambled back through the opening, emerging into the dust-choked cellar. The main entrance was completely blocked by a mountain of debris. The henchmen were trapped, their angry yells and futile pounding a muffled rhythm of her temporary victory. But Finch was on the other side of the collapse, and he was making his way around to the front of the house. She had only moments. She raced up the stairs and into the pantry. Wrenching the flagstone loose, she grabbed the heavy metal box of documents. This was the only thing that mattered. She ran to the back of the house as Finch's heavy fist began to pound on the front door. There was a loud crack as the old lock gave way. His footsteps echoed in the grand, empty foyer. "Amelia," he roared, his voice stripped of all civility. "You cannot hide from me." She unbolted the back kitchen door and ran out into the overgrown yard, clutching the box to her chest. She had a destination, a final contingency from Rowan's journal. A small, hidden bell tower atop the old stable, barely visible from the house. Samuel was watching. He was her signal to the outside world. She could hear Finch crashing through the house, his rage palpable. She reached the stable, the decaying structure groaning around her. She scrambled up the rickety ladder to the small belfry, the metal box banging painfully against her side. Below, Finch burst from the back door, his eyes scanning the property, a hunter seeking his cornered prey. He saw a flicker of movement in the stable and started toward it. Amelia reached the top, gasping for breath. She grabbed the thick, frayed bell rope and pulled with all her might. A single, loud, discordant clang echoed across the valley. It was the signal. A moment later, a second bell answered from the direction of Samuel's cabin, a clear, sharp tone confirming the message was received. Finch stopped, his head snapping up toward the sound. He understood. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a declaration. The trap was sprung. His face contorted in a mask of pure fury as he saw her in the belfry, holding the box. He drew a pistol. But it was too late. From the main road, another sound was growing louder, the thunder of approaching hooves. The sheriff, alerted by Samuel, was coming. Finch was caught. Defeated not by a weapon, but by a bell rope and a dead man's meticulous planning. The box of evidence felt heavy in her arms, a weight of truth that would finally crush him. The epilogue of Alastair Finch's reign was not written in headlines, but in the quiet, steady turning of legal wheels. The documents Amelia Thorne had protected were irrefutable. The original deeds, the signed affidavits from families long since scattered, the damning evidence of forgery and water theft, it all painted a picture of a sociopath who had built an empire on stolen futures. Finch was arrested that day, his handsome face a mask of disbelief as the sheriff, a man he had long considered a pawn, placed him in irons. His trial was swift. Stripped of his wealth and influence, he was just a man, and the evidence against him was a mountain. The families Rowan had documented were found, brought back to testify. Their stories, once dismissed as the bitter ramblings of the unsuccessful, were now heard in a hushed courtroom, each word a nail in Finch's coffin. The valley began to heal. The illegal dams on Finch's property were dismantled, and the water returned to its natural course. Creeks that had been dry for a generation began to flow again. The land, thirsty and starved, drank deeply. The territory government, shamed into action, established new laws protecting water rights, forever changing the balance of power. The story of Rowan Thorne changed, too. He was no longer the town fool, the dreamer who had bought a ruin. He was the Blackwood visionary, the man who saw the truth and gave his life to build a fortress to protect it. His name was cleared, his memory honored. Amelia used a small portion of the Spanish gold to fully restore Blackwood Manor. It was a slow, careful process. She and Lily lived in the small guest house while skilled craftsmen brought the mansion back to life, not as a monument to opulence, but as a warm, sturdy home. The rest of the treasure, the vast majority of it, was placed into a trust, managed by an honest lawyer from the capital. Its purpose was simple, to provide legal aid and financial support to families fighting land and water disputes against powerful, predatory figures like Finch. It was Rowan's final, greatest legacy. On a warm summer afternoon, a year later, Amelia stood on the grand veranda of her finished home. Lily chased butterflies in the newly planted garden, her laughter bright and carefree. The house stood proud and strong behind them, its windows clean and its walls solid. Amelia held Rowan's journal, its pages filled with his familiar script. She had not just inherited a house, she had inherited a mission. She had faced down a monster and won, not with force, but with the quiet, unyielding power of the truth. The valley was green, the water was free, and her daughter was safe. His vindication, and hers, was absolute.